What's up guys, Josh from Extreme Truck and Auto. We're gonna be putting a 7-inch BDS coilover kit on this Tundra today. This thing's gonna look sweet once we're done with it, so let's go ahead and get into the install. So normally I just skip to where I have the front end broken down because I've shown it to you guys a couple of times. Pretty much all trucks break down nearly the same. Remove brakes, rotors, all that other stuff, but there's one extra step for this BDS kit, and that is we need to loosen up the jam nut because it comes with new outer tie rod ends. So most lift kits will reuse it and flip it over or something along those lines. But on this kit, it does come with new outer tie rod ends. So we do have an extra step of doing that and then twisting it off and putting the new ones on. So I just wanted to make you guys aware of that. So I'm gonna get all the brakes, knuckle, all that stuff removed, and then I'll bring you guys back in and explain where we go from here. So we've got a rotor pulled. I went ahead and pulled the hub nut. Now it is a 33 millimeter 12 point, so make sure you have one of those if you're doing this lift. Now normally I would pull the hub and the knuckle all in one piece, but because Toyota likes to be cool and different, it's not always better. You actually need to pull the bolts from the inside of the hub as opposed to Ford, Chevy, and Dodge, which have the bolts on the backside, which I think is a better design. Before you pull any of this off, what you want to do is get your 17 millimeter wrench, bust all of these free and get the hub off, then continue on with your teardown. We've got our knuckles pulled. Next, where I'm moving on to is I'm going to come under here and I'm going to mark all of these cam bolts at the 12 o'clock position. So that way when I put in the new cross members, I can set those back to close to where they were, and that'll help me keep the alignment close enough to spec to where we can take it to our alignment shop and get it all aligned. So we've got our control arm pulled. I went ahead and lifted the vehicle up, pulled the skid plate that's sitting now down over here on the floor, and then I went up in here and already disconnected the drive shaft from the front differential. Push that up out of my way. I always mark the drive shaft so that way it can go back onto the differential the same way it came off, so there's no vibration issues. And then if you look right up in there where my finger is, those are the breather tubes you need to get to. They are a little bit of a pain, but once when you get them broken free and you get access to that clamp, they come off pretty easy. And the final thing while I'm under here before I lower it back down to pull the struts is this little electrical connector here for the differential four-wheel drive actuator box thingamajig. That's just a little plastic clip. What I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna drop it down. We're gonna pull the struts out of the vehicle, and then I'm gonna go find somebody to help me so we can get the diff pulled. Struts have been removed from the vehicle. Next thing I'm gonna do while I have it down low, as I actually dropped it a little bit lower, is I'm gonna disconnect the battery. So that way when I'm welding and cutting and doing whatever I need to do under it, none of the electronics are hooked up. You don't want to fry like a BCM, PCM, ECM, whatever. And also he does have a stereo system hooked up, so I don't want any current going through there and frying any of that. If you're gonna do any welding or plasma cutting to a vehicle, since it's a lot of energy going into the frame or the ground side, I always recommend that you at least disconnect the negative terminal on this one because of the stereo. I'm gonna do both. As you can see over here on the floor, we went ahead and got the differential out. Now on these Tundras, I do like to get help pulling them. I use typically transmission jack or something along those lines because of the way they need to rotate and the front two mounts. But now that we've got that out of our way, I went ahead and marked the frame. You'll find the measurements in BDS's instructions. This is what we're gonna be cutting out. We're gonna be cutting along the green lines and removing this section. That'll clearance the frame for the differential to be dropped down for the 7-inch kit. Once when we get these cut out, we're gonna get these little plates that BDS supplies welded in there. That's where the welding is that I told you guys about. Once when we get them all welded in, I'll bring you guys in. I'll show you kind of how everything looks, and then we'll move on from there. So we got our plates welded up in on both sides, and I have the front cross member installed. Now all the hardware is left loose because you don't tighten it down until you get the control arms in, but there is a bolt there, and then there's one that goes there, and then there is a washer that fits up here in between the frame and the new cross member. So don't forget those. The differential is our next step to go back in, and then we'll throw on the rear cross member. Before we throw this differential up into the truck, a couple of things we need to do is we need to replace these two breather tubes with our new ones. After we do that, I'm gonna get some help. We're gonna throw that up there. Essentially what we'll be doing is using 2 bolts there and there, those 2 areas, to hang the differential. I'll use my handy dandy transmission jack back over there to get it up into position. And then we'll have a little bit of trimming to do on the rear differential mount. When that is all done, it'll be bolting that rear cross member in and securing everything down. We got the diff back up in. You got your 2 bolts there, and then you got your diff mount back here that we pulled when we were removing the diff. So that goes back on. It's got a spot on the cross member that it'll attach in 2 locations, and then to the differential here at the rear. And then, I'm not sure if you noticed, we went ahead and threw on the bump stop bracket. So the bump stops that look like this, you just basically twist them off. They give you a new bolt, it threads in there. Bracket goes back to that bolt over there, and then your new bump stops go on there. That's kind of everything before we get to tightening it on, besides the lower control arms that I need to throw in. So we'll get those thrown in, everything kind of tightened down, and we'll just keep trucking along. So what we're looking at here is the driver's side control arm. And what we need to do is weld on basically these little pieces of metal here, and they're gonna keep the vehicle from turning too far. We'll get those burned on, get them thrown in, and then like I had mentioned earlier, we'll go ahead and bring you guys back when we get all that in and we're tightening everything down. Got all of our cross member and differential bolts snug down. We've went ahead and threw the skid plate on. There's a plastic 3-inch spacer that goes in the middle right here of the front cross member. Beyond that, it's just 19mm bolts and threaded holes on the cross members. We've got our breather tubes in, and then we're coming down here to the drive shaft where you see this little mark. Up on the differential is my little mark right there. So I'm just gonna line those up. And then that way, when we go to tighten it down, we know we're not gonna need driveline vibration. I just do that, so that way it goes on the same way it came off. And then it's to assembly of all the knuckles and adding in the coilovers. Now it's time for the knuckles. What we're gonna be doing is very carefully with a screwdriver and a hammer from the front side of the hub is we're gonna punch this seal out and install it into the new knuckle. You wanna be very careful on this side and basically line your screwdriver up just right on the edge and give it light taps. You don't need a lot of force. That goes for uninstalling and reinstalling it into the new one. So I'll show you what that looks like when we're all done. Lost some footage yesterday, so I'm gonna go back through. I meant to show you guys what the seal looks like installed. So if we come around back here on the CV axle, you can see that it's all flush. Now, when you're going to tap this on, you wanna do really light taps around the seal. That way you don't damage it. And one thing you will hear is a tone change when you're tapping on the seal. So that way, when you hear that tone change, you know it's seated properly. Coming up to the coilover, we went ahead and threw this in. That was part of the corrupt footage. Couple things to go over here is that you have a fat spacer and a small spacer. The fat spacer goes to the front, the small one goes toward the rear. Up here, you'll kind of see an offset to it. You want to make sure the offset or the bent edge is towards the rear of the vehicle, and your hose is coming out towards the front for your reservoir. I will tell you guys, you want to make sure the bolt right up in here gets put on before you put this entire assembly up in there. Otherwise, there's no way to get it in there. And then these bolts up here were a bit of a pain in the butt to install. Just keep that in mind. You'll want to install the upper portion before you do the lower portion. That way it goes in smoothly and allows you to move the strut out of the way. One thing I wish Fox BDS would have done is, instead of using a bolt, making these a stud. I don't know if there's a reason for that, but in my opinion, it would have made life quite a bit easier. We are going to move on to connecting the knuckle to the control arm, putting on the new sway bar end links, and getting the hubs back on. Hubs on, backing plate goes in between the hub and the knuckle. We've got our lower ball joint all done and marked up, ready to go. hub nuts back on it. You just tap the cap back on. Where we go from here is we have clearance issues right here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm basically gonna come and trim along there, which will allow the caliper to drop low enough so that way I can get the caliper back onto the knuckle. They do mention that there may be clearance issues in the instructions. That's what I've run into. So I'm gonna do this on both sides. We're gonna get the brakes thrown on, all the wires and stuff routed. From there, we're gonna go to the sway bar end links, and the reservoir. Got all of the ABS wire and everything routed. One thing to make note of is you do want this facing in towards the strut. It's the brake line drop bracket. We've got our new tie rod ends on. ABS and all that is attached. I went ahead and installed the reservoir kind of bracket, and then the sway bar relocation bracket. Now, one thing I'm gonna do to make my life a little bit easier is I'm gonna wait to adjust the end links and tighten them down until the vehicle's on the ground, because if you do not, the bushing gets at a really weird angle and it makes getting the bolt back into that hole really, really annoying. From there, it's just a few odds and ends to button up, making sure our mark, once again, on all these cam bolts is straight up and down, so that way we can drive this thing to alignment and not have a bunch of issues. That pretty much wraps up the front, and then we'll be throwing on the spiffy new wheel and tires. We've got a set of BFG mud terrain and a 37-1250-20 on, I believe, a 20x10 wheel. So yeah, I can't wait to see the truck completely done, but we're gonna go ahead and get moving on to the rear. So the first thing I like to do before I get into disconnecting the shocks is to go ahead and put all of the bracketry that's gonna allow us to drop the rear axle. And one part that you need to do is bend this thing down. As easy as that. And then we'll go through and we're gonna pull all of these 12 millimeters here. And then over here, we've got one more set of, there's one on each side, 12 millimeter that we need to pull. Once we do that, we'll go ahead and throw all the bracketry on, but I'm gonna wait to hook it up. So that way, if it needs to drop further than the bracketry allows, we're able to do that without stretching anything. So let me get all these brackets thrown on and I'll show you guys what I'm talking about. So here's what I was talking about. I'm gonna leave this loose, but I went ahead and installed the bracket there. Now these brake lines, you do flip them over from their original position, so I went ahead and strapped them down, but I left the hard line up here loose, and then this loose, and the other parking brake cable loose on the other side. One other thing I did really fast was I installed the carrier bearing drop, and all that is plastic spacers and bolts. Just, you want to make sure you Loctite these in, because you do not want this coming free. It's a bad day if it does. So I go ahead and use red Loctite on those, because I do not want those to come free, and they do not come out very often. So I thought I'd fill you guys in that. Now we're on to pulling the shocks, the U-bolts, putting in the new shocks, the new U-bolts, and the lift blocks. And then that's pretty much it. One thing I do want to mention is these Toyotas do love to have these upper shock bolt seized. So one thing you can do is you can pull down this boot and grab it with vice grips up here or on the shaft if needed. There is a spot up here that you can grab it as well. It's typically the first initial break free of the nut that you have an issue with. Once you get through that, it's pretty straightforward. It comes right off. We'll get all this taken care of and we'll get this onto alignment. So that'll wrap up this kit from BDS on this 19, I think it's 19 or 20 Tundra. Got all my bolts paint marked, all the extension brackets are on. So now we'll just throw wheels and tires and I'll get some final shots for you guys. So that's it when it comes to this 7-inch BDS kit on this 19 Tundra. Yes, I did confirm that because I didn't know that. If you guys have any questions on the build, I know this was more of an overview than how to, go ahead and drop them in the comments below. Like always, make sure you're subscribed and I'll catch you guys on the next one.